Hey everyone, good morning. I want to use this panel as an opportunity to talk about the millennial generation in particular, a generation that's been pinched by two economic realities. First, the reality of rising student debt, more than $1 trillion, I think $1.5 trillion outstanding student loan debt. And then on the other hand, you have the fact of the Great Recession and its aftermath. And I think a frustration among a lot of young people is this idea that they sort of followed the rule of the law. They did everything they were told to do. They went to college, they got a degree, they graduated even though they took on some student debt to do so, and then they graduated into an economy that wasn't yet ready to receive them. And as a result, this is a generation that, compared to previous generations at the same age, earns less and has less ownership. So we're going to talk a little bit about the issues that are particularly important to that generation. Lindsey, I want to start with you. In Refinery 29, you guys have published countless money diaries, a really, really popular feature of Refinery 29. You've also published a book that has sort of combined all of these money diaries. One theme that I think emerges from the money diaries is the fact that, and this is something that's talked about a lot, this is a generation that seems to give preference to experiences over products. Help us sort of understand exactly what that saying means and whether or not you think, as someone who is seeing into Millennial Diaries, whether or not it's actually true.
Yeah, it's been amazing working on all those money diaries and reading them all. And it's sad because some of the stereotypes are true. The first diary we ever ran on the site, the woman actually bought avocado toast, which was really funny. But we did see them. They very rarely bought clothes, shoes, but they were spending a lot of money on skincare, on workout classes, on things like that, on experiences, and that was really something that drove the spending. And then also we saw a lot of times that they had big student loan debt, so the things, their disposable income was often smaller.
Right. Judith, there is this sort of line that has been circulated. I believe it originated in a New York Post essay, which essentially said that the reason that millennials don't own homes is because they buy too many lattes and avocado toast.
Right.
Now, I don't know exactly how buying a little bit less avocado toast and milk would allow you to make a $100,000 down payment, but we'll put that to the side. I want to talk specifically about the issue of home ownership itself, because it is a fact that according to a Federal Reserve study that just came out last year, millennials do have significantly less home ownership than previous generations at the same age. Do you think this is an important stat, and why?
I do think it is an important stat, and I think the fact is my parents owned a home, and one of the reasons they were able to get that home is because my grandparents helped them get that home. So they had savings, but they also had help from my grandparents to do so. And I think the fact is that of a certain generation, a lot of people, that was a thing that happened for a lot of people. I don't know that people in my generation have parents that are as equipped to do the same thing for their children. And so, yes, to a certain degree, there are definitely people that I know who are getting into that now, but they're, one, not buying homes on the same scale that our parents' generation did. They couldn't afford that unless they have a much higher income. But two, I think it is something that, for better or worse, because home ownership as a vehicle to generational wealth is a very troubling concept, but something that still I know a lot of people in my generation are really interested in doing, both because they do understand that it is something that as a center, as a hub for your family can be really valuable emotionally, and in terms of like just having a place, not feeling displaced, but also because of the reality that many people in our country still do build their wealth off of home ownership, whether they choose to sell it, whether they choose to pass it down. And so it's just a simple fact that it's not, coffees and things like that only. It's their parents not being able to do the same thing that perhaps past generations could have done. And maybe they'll be doing it later more to a certain degree, but I do think it's sort of a permanent impact that'll have a ripple effect that we see.
Ramit, you're a heterodox, somewhat counterintuitive personal finance guy. I wonder, what is your take on home ownership, which on the one hand is a huge part of the American dream, but on the other hand, a part of the American dream that I suppose a lot of members of this generation are avoiding, either because they want to stake a new path or because they simply can't afford a home in the first place?
My experience with personal finance has been that when I started learning about it and I took a step back, I realized how much of it was really similar to that old story, the emperor has no clothes. The typical advice that we've gotten for so long started to be less relevant, or I frankly just disagreed with it. And home ownership is one of the perfect examples of it. In fact, it is the single most popular topic that I write about on my newsletter, site, social media, etc. Because in this country, real estate is religion. And we even have these handy phrases that we toss around at the dinner table. Do it for the tax advantage. Rent is, you're just throwing money away on rent. And it sounds logical, but when you actually break down the numbers, you realize, particularly in high cost of living areas like New York City, it often makes very little financial sense to buy. And when I write about it, and when I actually break down the numbers, it evokes a very, very heated reaction. Why? Because we have been taught this thing over and over for generations, and if that's not true, then what else might not be true in personal finance?
Yeah, so I guess I wonder, just to push back lightly on the issue of homeownership. So I agree that maybe in a place like New York City or San Francisco, it might make more sense to rent as opposed to buy. And there are calculators that you can access online that says, here's the rent to buy ratio, and here's how you make that determination. I would imagine, in a city like Manhattan, population of 5 million, maybe 1.5 million are millennials. There's 86 million millennials in the United States. So that's about 3% of the nation's millennials living in places that are really, really expensive, like San Francisco and New York City. How does this advice affect the other 84 million Americans? 84 million Americans, say between, I guess, 22 and 37 right now, who are not living in San Francisco and New York City.
So it's a great question. The advice is not rent forever. That's not the advice. The advice is run the numbers and identify the financial side of ownership as well as the other sides. There are lots of reasons to buy a house. Maybe you have kids, you want to go to a certain school district. Maybe you just really like to customize it. But you certainly, for the largest purchase in your life, need to understand the numbers front, back, and every other way. Most people do not. They take these handy phrases, they go with their gut, and that's the wrong thing to do with major purchases.
So you're saying don't make it a religion, make it a matter of math and accounting. Yeah, that makes sense to me. You have other ideas about the downsides of personal finance advice, including the fact that you're not a big fan of budgets, which, speaking of the religion of personal finance, this is, Genesis.
Oh, yeah.
What's the problem with budgets in your mind?
Well, look, I started learning about money because I took some of my college scholarship money and I invested it in the stock market, thinking I was a genius, picking individual stocks, and then I lost half that money immediately. So I learned quickly I'm not as smart as I thought. And I started reading all the advice, the books, watching the TV shows, and one pattern in personal finance is this concept of no. Everybody starts by saying no, no, no. No, you can't buy lattes. No, you can't go on vacation. No, in fact, just save your money for the next 80 years and maybe you'll be able to live a rich life. And I took a look at my friends, and none of us wanted to live like that. And in fact, that advice about lattes and budgets, nobody even listens to it anyway. And so I want to be realistic. Let's figure out what people actually want to do and start there. So instead of focusing on cutting back on $3 questions, which is what everybody asks, what I teach is how to focus on $30,000 questions. Let's make sure you're automatically investing and you understand asset allocation. Do you know how few people have ever heard the term asset allocation, and instead they feel guilty about these $3 expenses? You could cut all the lattes for the rest of your life. It's actually not going to add up to much. But if you automatically invest, your allocation is correct, you have a good job, and you negotiate your salary, those 5 to 10 big wins in life mean you can order as many lattes or desserts as you want.
So you're saying nail the big wins, then you don't have to worry about the small ball. I wonder, Lindsey, because the Money Diaries are in many ways a testimony of small ball decisions, the degree to which you agree with the idea that budgeting might be a 1950s passé idea of personal finance.
Yeah, I don't agree with budgets, but I actually don't agree with Ramit on not buying the latte. Okay.
No budgets and no latte.
No budgets, no lattes. No, you can buy the latte if you can afford the latte, but we were really seeing with there's all that research that suggests that most Americans can't afford a over $400 expense without putting it on their credit card first. And you think about the credit card debt that racks up and racks up and racks up. And I just think that sometimes, maybe you can't afford that latte. And that kind of sucks. But there are, that's the reality of things. And while it is a small expense, $5 a day, because let's be real, that's what a latte costs. I've been to the cafeteria at my office and bought a latte and a cookie, and somehow it's $11 after tip, right? That is not nothing. That's $60 a week. That adds up over the year. If you don't have an emergency fund, it's going to be so much more expensive when you put it on your credit card. So I get a little nervous when people say you can have the latte. I agree, like you need to be automating things, you need to understand investing, but at the very least, have a high yield savings account and be putting some money into it. I think the small wins can really add up.
Judith, I wonder, as our tiebreaker here,
Yeah.
where you fall on the latte spectrum.
I fall in between, and I think it's a really good question. I think for me, the concern that I have is an obsession with this idea that penny pinching will get you to wealth or to even stability, and I just think that's unrealistic, and I don't think it bears out in fact. And I think, of course, people bring up the idea of personal responsibility, and I absolutely agree that there's an extent to which you need to one, look at your accounts, and that was a breakthrough for me when I was younger. Like that fear of looking because you don't know whether it's good or bad, and you're like, oh my God. And so that goes into that. You don't have to have that fear once you're realistic. But I do think there's a certain extent to which we are not honest about how stability generates stability, right? And how having a certain degree of security generates more security. And so I think the two go hand in hand. I do totally agree that a larger concern over, if we're talking about investing, is not, do you then put the $3 into your account? It's, do you actually understand what asset allocation is? Do you understand what a 401k is? And that there is a certain degree of shame over not knowing those things either, and that is just as crucial and will bear you out in the long term. So I do think it's both. I just think that understanding personal responsibility is personal, of course, and understanding your habits, understanding your emotional ties to money. I think that can sometimes be a larger issue than the money itself, because there are plenty of people who have plenty of money and do all kinds of things with it. As we saw in the Money Diaries, it wasn't as if all of the people who had higher incomes were just wildly responsible and they got there. They just happened to make a lot of money, which is great for them. But I think that there were habits that they could have done too, but no one's paying attention to them buying lattes because they owned property at like 24.
Right.
I think to Judith's point about generational wealth and about penny pinching to get you to riches, I agree with you. And I think that there was a real pushback this summer over personal finance advice. I'm sure Ramit felt this too, where it's this idea of like, we're so in debt, we're never going to get ahead. And so we don't want to have any personal finance advice. We don't want to hear it at all. We don't want to hear that we can't buy the lattes. And that to me is a really interesting conversation that's been happening on Twitter, where it's like, well, okay, the debt is really scary, but does that really give you an excuse to just not say, I'm going to stick my head in the sand and not really face head on my finances?
Yeah, Ramit, actually, I wonder what you have to say about that, because on the one hand, I'm really glad you said that, because the columns on CNBC that I was reading were ludicrous. It was like, I didn't buy coffee at a coffee shop for 25 straight years, and now I own an island.
Well,
it's like, I feel like there might be some details missing in this story, such as you own a coffee company, and that's why you didn't have to visit the coffee shop.
Maybe someone gave you
$10 million.
I'll tell you what, people in America love to idolize rich people who act like they are poor. And we see this in columns where you have somebody saying, I don't buy a latte, and the guy's wearing a $6,000 suit. I looked at the photo. It's crazy. And there's a total lack of honesty here. Oh, I fly economy. Okay, you do, but you also have a house that's $7.5 million. Right. So let's get real. I remember having this conversation. I started to get a lot of Instagram DMs. And people are more or less honest depending on the channel. For example, they're extremely honest in email responses and Instagram DMs because it's private. They're a little bit more politically correct when they are posting on Twitter where everybody can see it. So I started getting a lot of DMs from people who asked me about, how do I start saving for my children? Great question. And I asked them this question first. I said, first, tell me about your finances. And typically they were in their early 40s. Okay, so they have children that are, young. And almost all of them said, well, look, I have, $4,000 in savings, et cetera, et cetera. They did not have a lot of savings for their age. And as I started to ask, tell me more about why are you focused on saving for your children? What about yourself? The basic undercurrent was, I have lost the game of personal finance for myself. I give up, and now I'm going to start fresh with my son or daughter. And I think that is where personal responsibility and being honest can really make a difference. Your son or daughter has time. You do not. And so it's time to actually get honest with yourself, look at your finances, clarify your spending, start investing automatically, and you can still play this game. You may not be able to win like someone who started investing at 19, but you still can. And again, focusing on what is relevant to you today is something that I'm urging people in personal finance to do, as opposed to giving them an encyclopedia of information they could use, but may not be relevant today.
Yeah, that's great. I want to end with this question for you, Judith, on the issue of intergenerational finances, because the millennial generation is not only coming into its own as sort of the prime sector of the labor force, but also their parents are starting to age. And this creates a whole new bundle of issues, whether it's intergenerational transmission of wealth or caring for aging parents. You write a lot about these issues. You talk to people who are dealing with these issues. What are you seeing as the factors with regard to intergenerational wealth and intergenerational sort of, finances that people are really anxious about today?
Yeah, I've seen it, whether it's stories we did when we were at R29 or just talking among my friends or even myself. There are a lot of people my age who are already, if not caring to a certain degree for their parents, supporting them, supporting their siblings. And it's not so much about looking into what did their parents did wrong, it's just the fact of the matter. And I remember speaking to someone, another source, sort of discussing what is the approach and the way to handle this, and their sort of idea was, well, you just need to say no. And I think one, that it's just not a realistic thing for a lot of people, for a lot of cultures, for a lot of communities. I do think there is a gesture towards saying, okay, how, the life preserver idea, how can I be okay first so that I can then help whoever needs the help in my family? But I do think that the immediate, well, you just need to take care of yourself is just not a realistic or even a desirable tactic for many people. So I do definitely see that. I think one thing that is really crucial and has been important for me in my personal life too is even having these conversations. When my dad, and not to violate HIPAA or whatever, but give too much of his own life, he was ill a few years ago, and when we were in the hospital, it was, did I know what medications he was on? I had no idea. I'd seen them, but I didn't know the names of them. Understanding more about the costs of these things. Diabetes medication is it's almost unspeakable, and that's something that people are making this parsing out, and has a very real impact. Then, do people get sicker because of that? But even just having the conversations, understanding what care might your parents need. Are you this feels very serious, and it's not a first date conversation. But when you do start to partner up, are you talking to your partner about what healthcare needs your parents might have, because that may impact your finances. Some of your finances may be going toward taking care of parents, in some cases taking care of siblings and things like that, because if you are the earner, if you are not the earner, do you allocate some time, and does that mean then you lose some income? These are huge questions, and I think it was relevant too to the last panel. You're never going to have it all out in one conversation. It is very difficult. It's very hard, it's very emotionally charged. I think there's a sense of people on both sides feeling like they don't have control. I've gotten in arguments with my own parents about, what to do with a laptop, and that goes insane. And so going further than that can be really hard. But I think there are conversations that start now, and that will continue then. But I do know that that's a major concern among a lot of my peers.
I'm really glad we ended this part of the conversation on that note, because I don't think that it's something that's typically necessarily a part of anyone's daily diary of how they're spending, and it's not part of the 1950s style of personal finance. It's a relatively new phenomenon. People are living longer, and as a result, you're going to have to, there's hopefully a longer amount of time that you're going to be taking care of your parents. Let's turn to some of the questions. The first one they have from the audience is, should I pay down all debt before I start saving or investing? It's an important question, I think, for this generation that has over $1 trillion worth of student loan debt. Who wants to take this first one?
I can take it.
Okay.
I recommend, so in my book, I talk about the different strategies you can use. And I do recommend that you start investing while you are paying down debt, even if it takes you a little longer to pay that debt down. A couple of reasons. Number one, it's really important to build that habit of investing. And what happens is a lot of times people think, let me pay this debt down, and then once it's paid off, I will magically start investing. But the activation energy to start investing is quite high. You need to log on, create an account. What's an IRA? I don't get all this stuff. Better to do that now, even if you can put $50 or $100 a month into it. And then when you have more available capital, you can turn that dial up to 200, 300, 400, or 10 times that for some people. That is critical. So I would recommend that, and I think that answer really focuses on the behavioral and the psychological side of money. There's more to money than just what's in your Excel spreadsheet. Yeah. It's about understanding yourself. It's also about being humble enough to know human behavior means we are ultimately lazy. We don't want to take a lot of energy and time, even though money is one of the most important things in our lives. So let's admit it. Let's acknowledge it, let's automate it as much as possible, and then let's get on with our life, because as I always say, a rich life is lived outside the spreadsheet. It's not sitting fiddling with Excel, it's being here, it's being with your family, it's traveling, or whatever your hobbies or career are. That's the rich life. The money is just a way that helps you get there.
That's great.
The one rebuttal I would say to that, though, is I do think it's important for people who have high consumer debt, high credit card debt, to really, really focus on prioritizing that in some way. I do think that there is a certain extent to which some of those two things can happen concurrently. I think that, though, for some people who do not have a lot of money and have high interest debt, having some cash on hand that is accessible, which is not accessible if you're investing it, is crucial. I think that if you talked about that $400 emergency stat, I think obviously the returns aren't as high, but if you can save a little bit but still have it to a certain degree accessible, so that if you do run into something and you're paying down debt, well, then you can take care of that. But I do think there's a certain extent to which people need to make sure that they have something accessible.
Yeah, there's this great financial advisor, Manisha Thakor, who I quote in my book, where she talks about building up that $2,000 savings account, and that should be your number one first goal. Everybody talks so much about paying off your student loans quickly or investing in your 401k, all really important, but getting that cash savings, I think, is really crucial.
And one quick thing, the snowball, all the tactics that you mentioned, for example, I do think there is a certain extent to also, if you are getting in the habit, and it is a habit of paying off that high interest debt, of building up an emergency fund, once you have that habit established, and then you have more, funds available overall, you can then push a lot of that into investing to catch up. Yeah. I do think that you might be in more trouble if you put all of that in a vehicle you cannot access, and then something happens.
That's great. One last question. Can you comment on the massive difference in net wealth based on race and how this perpetuates inequality? A really important question.
We were talking about that a bit backstage, and it was related to the idea of home ownership. And one of the things we were, chatting about is I think that home ownership is not just, as I mentioned sort of before, a question of a financial experience and a financial benefit, but an experiential one. And I do think that across the country, regardless of race or ethnicity, people are there's an obsession with home ownership, and it's emotional, and it's seen still to a certain degree as like the American dream. I know, there is a very real way in which home ownership has built the wealth of many people in this country, and lack of home ownership among Black Americans in particular is a very real reason why they have not achieved that to the same degree. It's a fact. I think I've been seeing, whether it be on the Atlantic and other places, there are a lot of articles about deed theft and about how that is impacting people. And I think that it's just a reality that there are certain ways that people have access to building wealth, and that home ownership is one of that. And I think that, again, we can talk about saving and all of those kinds of things that are individual, but that is one aspect to which, in a very real way, society is structured about building wealth for a certain set of people, and it's much harder for others.
That's great. Please thank me for joining this excellent panel. Thank you, guys.